So friends, we are in the middle of discussing the novel Malloy by Beckett, and the first part devoted itself to the processes that the writer went through at the level of a creator and at the level of understanding himself in a situation which was one of the most difficult ones in human history in the post-World War time. What is already known to you is that the first part is terse, it is difficult, it's about silence, and it uses very few words, and if there are words, then those words are always punctuated by silences. But Dr. Payal Nagpal has anticipated that the second part is going to be just the opposite of what the first part was, and that if the negation is there in the first part of the novel form, in the second part the novel will take off in a different manner. So I am curious to know, and I request Dr. Payal Nagpal to please present the analysis of the second part of Malloy.
So the first part is intense. Actually, it has a lot of emotion, and as I mentioned, a lot of characters. I'd just like to share a quotation here where he says that art is the apotheosis of solitude, and there is no communication because there are no vehicles of communication. And this is a very important point for us to take away, because here again I bring in the question of how does a writer deal with his immediate or her immediate reality and capture it in words. And what Beckett is clearly stating through the novel is that the way in which writers wrote about their reality 20, 30 years ago, they cannot do it in the same manner. And to actually put this forth, as Professor Prakash just mentioned, that we are looking at two very different styles here. So the first is intense, it's profuse, it goes on, page after page after page, and then we move to the second part, which would read like almost like, if I may say so, almost like a 19th century narrative. Of course, it's not as objective, but compared to the first part, it is a totally objective narrative. And for instance, it's a story about Shraks Moran and his son, who's called Shraks. So Moran is he has to look for Malloy, and he goes into the forest. So his entire life, his preparation for going into the forest to look for Malloy, it goes on like that. And then yet again, towards the end of the novel, there is a new style again that Beckett brings in, and I'll come to that a little later. So if for instance, the kind of questions that are raised, I spoke about negation in the first part. So was she already dead, he asks, when I came, or did she only die later? I mean, enough to bury, I don't know, he says. Perhaps they haven't buried her yet. In any case, I have her room. So this is a reference to the mother, and it is not clear whether she is around or she's not. There's an indication that she's probably dead, but that's about it. But it is, as mentioned, the journey outside. That is very, very significant here. So characters, again, this is again from the first part, A and C. That's how characters are mentioned. So of course some of them do get a name later, like we have Luz and we have Ruth. So these are the two women here. So he wonders, I mean, A and C, who are they? Who is A and who is C? Is the character that we are looking at A really A, or is he C? So again, when we name places, when we name characters, do these names really adhere to the person? These are all questions that, of course, are going to be explored, interrogated by literary theory later. So again, the idea of, he communicates with the mother through the knocks. Now the first knock indicates something, the second indicates another thing, the third and the fourth. But he says that by the time there is the second knock, she completely forgets everything. So how our mind, how memory plays out, it is as if, they had never been, you don't really think of it like that. You don't, your experience of life is something that is about erasure, it's about forgetting. So how do you remember what, each indication is supposed to really speaking mean? So, and he says then his own name he says, and this is a very, very famous quotation from Molloy, he says, "And suddenly I remembered my name, Molloy. My name is Molloy? I cried all of a sudden. Now I remember. Nothing compelled me to give this information, but I gave it hoping to please, I suppose. They let me keep my hat on. I don't know why." "Is it your mother's name?" said the sergeant. It must have been a sergeant. Molloy. And so, and the idea of the hat immediately reminded me of Waiting for Godot, and the way in which the hat is an indication, really speaking of remembering, of memory. This quotation goes on, and the sergeant says that, "Yeah, well, take your time. If your name is Molloy, remember, is it, and is your mother's name also Molloy?" So, with this, different areas, different places, individuals, and everything around them is kind of being described. So he reaches a particular town and he says that, "Is this town X? Is this the name of my town?" And this name, he says that I really speaking seek, and he says that it continues to escape him, and he's not sure. So he says that maybe, at times the sense of motion in life, of movement, that he says that, he had fallen asleep, and suddenly there were these two bars divided into three segments, and the middle is constant, and he wonders, what is moving? Is he moving, or is the moon moving? So what is the larger question that Beckett is asking? I think he's asking about the individual's place in in this world, and the idea of movement, because circularity, as we know, and repetition is very, very central to Beckett's writing. And so the idea about, are we really moving, or are we actually exactly where we were? And this is a very important point for us, because it is a question on development, on the idea that when we talk about development and say that, well, we have moved from point A to point Z. So have we really moved that far? Or are we actually probably just as undeveloped as we were earlier, and maybe things around us are moving, and we have not really been able to kind of partake of it? Then again, the use of the body, the use of the scatological, the use of the muck, the idea that life, really speaking, belongs to it. So again, the woman who's mentioned as at times Lou and at times as Louse, as Lousse, and he says that, was she really a woman? And then he says that, or maybe, is this androgynous? And of course, Molloy has this bicycle, and he's unable to, there's a sense of disability. And this sense of disability in the first part is replicated in the second part in Moran, who has a sudden pain in his knee, and he's totally immobilized, and he has to send his son away to get a bicycle. And he says that, I'm not going to call my bicycle a bike. So he says that I'm writing, I'm talking about myself, one part of me describing what another part of me is doing. I am both the observer and the object I observe. Which of the two is the real? Now, as we move into the second part, we look at the first part, we look at the writer, we look at the narrator who undertakes a journey of recollection in his mind of maybe events that were real, or his responses to people. And when we move to the second part, there is a physical journey that is being described. We are moving forward in time, as I said. But again, are they the same person, or are Moran and Molloy two different people? There is also a sense of ambiguity that is left there. So, when we move to what we can easily call the rational narrative of part 2, it is totally objective. One does not have to stretch one's mind or imagination to recreate the scene. It is physically there. There's a reference to all the activities that are performed, the daily activities that are performed by Moran, by his son. And if I were to just share a few lines from the second part, and he says, perhaps I had invented him. I mean, found him ready-made in my head. There is no doubt one sometimes meets with strangers who are not entire strangers, through their having played a part in certain cerebral reels. Between the Molloy I stalked within me and the true Molloy, after whom I was so soon to be in full cry over hill and dale, the resemblance cannot happen great. There is a clear spelling out of what he's thinking, and this kind of direct spelling out is missing in part 1. It's always oblique, and it's always as if one moves from nature, maybe the clothes that these individuals are wearing, all other objects, to arrive at what we can call the center, the central point. Whereas the second part uses the conventional trope of actually moving from one point to the next. So a lot of it, there are clear descriptions of his son's life, of the helper Martha, and then how he plans his journey, and how he is very upset at the fact that the son disappears and he's not got the bicycle, and he undergoes this phase when he's feeling very low about why his son has not come back. And so again, when he does, and the coming of the bicycle again is something that ties up with the bicycle, becomes a trope that runs through the novel. It is there in part 1, it is there in part 2. Another aspect that's there in both parts is that sense of disability about the narrator who's lying immobilized in part 1, and his description about a kind of bicycle, and he almost says that, if at all there could possibly be a bicycle of this sort, and the way in which he adjusts himself and he uses the bicycle. Again, in the second part, we see the same thing. Now, the bicycle can mean many things. It can mean the journey, it can mean travel, but bicycle is also formed by the wheel, and the wheels represent circularity. So, despite the presence of the bicycle, is there any movement, is what one really needs to ask. And so, and again, the use of non sequiturs, something that Beckett is famous for, that the answers don't necessarily answer the questions. And he says this in part 2, that the answers did not always follow in the order of the questions, but while looking for the answer or the answers, he says it is in this process for looking for the answer that he found the answer, which means that what we arrive at is not significant, but it is the journey of locating the answer, of posing the question. And again, it is clearly reflective of the times, and Beckett is very, very concerned about it. He's saying that it's important to at least try and look for questions that represent the times. It is important to look for possible answers. The answer may not be the answer to the question that is being posed, but the process of looking might one day lead us to an answer that will be the correct answer, in a sense, to the question. And so, in fact, another technique that's used in part 2, which will clearly explicate his use of the rational here, is, for instance, these are a series of questions. This is a quotation from the novel, part 2, where he says, "Why had I obeyed," Moran asks these questions, "why had I obeyed the order to go home? What had become of Molloy?" And he asks himself, same question for me. And what would become of me? Then he says, same question for my son. Was his mother in heaven? Same question he says that, for my mother. And so, of course, he's talking about religion, he's talking about his son, he's talking about Molloy, and the way in which there are these parallels and, links between Molloy and him, which, of course, as I said, that create the notion that it's probably the two different cells of the same person, rather multiple cells, in a sense, of the same person. And he also lists characters, as you can see in question 10, that would we all meet together? My son, his mother, Yaudi, Geber, Molloy, his mother, and Murphy, Watt. And so, Murphy, Watt are names of novels that he has written. So these characters, will everybody come together, is what he is asking. So he says that at first I did not know what it wanted, but in the end I understood this language, he says. I understood it, I understand it, all wrong perhaps. That is not what matters. It told me to write the report. And the report again brings us to the rational part of objectively writing a report. But the point to take away from here is about language. He says, I may have got it wrong, perhaps, but he says it doesn't matter. What matters is experimenting and looking for words that fit the times. I would request Professor Prakash here to please, share his views on this particular quotation, particularly about language. And he says that I understood it and I may have got it all wrong, but he says that is not important.
No, the points that you are making are very engaging in the philosophical sense, in the sense of existence, in the sense of relevance of the descriptions to the times when he is writing. So that is very useful and very educative. I have one or two things of a simple nature to ask. I believe that this person is not taking up any upper class people or any intelligentsia. He is just picking up characters and voices from ordinary background, from a village, for instance, or maybe it's a son who's talking about his father or his mother, or it's a village, or it's a geographical space. And the language is so simple. In spite of the difficult ideas that you explicate in the discussion, the language is so simple. We use all those words. Now something like ready-made, in the head.
Yes.
This is what you read out. And I straight away thought that this is a cliche. But he's using this cliche with some effect. And that's how people talk. So I believe that when it came to picking up characters from the life of the time, then Beckett was specifically taking his characters from the road, so to say.
Yes.
And then he would elevate them to the level of awareness about the world in which these people lived. And the second query, I would like to know whether I'm reading it right. And the second thing is that he is all the time critiquing something that may be absent from the reference, but which is already there around him. He's talking about, as you said, stasis, that people move. They try to move, but they remain there itself, and that there is no development. There is only stagnation, and that people rot. You talked about scatology, so which means, and there is muck. These are the words you used. So which means that he seems to have seen through the very splendor, so to say, which means nothing to him.
Yes.
And what means are the essential factors. Am I getting it rightly, Dr. Payal Nagpal?
Absolutely, sir, because what we are really, both the points are very, very important. The first, that these are all ordinary characters. There is no character really speaking from the upper class. If one looks at it, then, and there is a reference, twice there is a reference to, even the fact that when he comes across a group of people and there is a dog that dies and everybody is about to attack him, and the woman says that no, he's actually, the dog was in any case not well and was about to breathe his last, and he's kind of saved me in a sense from getting anything else done. So they are all characters that you kind of meet while you're walking down the road. Mm-hmm. It's a scene that is described like that. Mm-hmm. And again, the second point about the muck and scatology, the fact that ultimately the splendor has absolutely no meaning, and the big talk about development and moving forward, it really has no meaning at all. And he counters this through his narrative style. He counters this through his style of writing. And in fact, there are sections, actually. There is a section where there is this long speech about night, and the one that I also indicated right now about the moon. And they immediately take us also to Waiting for Godot. And there are such strong parallels in their sections, and the kind of poetic tone that he actually uses here is something that one does see, despite the brevity, the terseness. There are these, the references, for instance, about accursed time in Waiting for Godot, and when night comes, there's a poetic bit that is there in Waiting for Godot also. So there are these overlaps, and which is why I think the concerns, as you rightly put it, are social, are all there, and he may not be referring to them objectively, so to say, but they are absent from the center, and yet they form the center. And his narrative is probably built around this kind of an absence.
Suppose I would ask, is there a narrative in the novel? There is a story, there is a beginning, it leads towards the middle and the end, the kind of thing that might generally occur in an ordinary novel?
Yes, thank you so much for this one, because this is exactly how I wanted to kind of end the discussion on this novel,
Okay.
because these are the two parts actually. So as I said, the second part actually has a kind of beginning and middle and end, and in which there is the possibility of actually mapping a physical journey and creating in one's own mind the sense of, let's say, Moran, his son, Martha, the house that they live in, their journey into the forest and so on. Of course, it is also abstract at times, but when we compare it to the first part, this is the objective part. And to my mind, another thought came, which was that Beckett is also experimenting with the technique of writing and asking that at times when we read the first part, we find it very difficult. But when one finishes reading the second part of this novel, you almost want to go back to the first one for the kind of sheer poetry that he's written over there. And it also tells us that it's easy to be critical of writing that is totally to do with meta language, but it has value because the way in which it captures emotion, the way in which it captures at times the individual's desolation, the characters who one meets on the road, the ordinariness of life and emotions associated with ordinariness of life, all this is very well brought out in the first part, which does not have a plot per se. And it's a recollection in a sense of people he has met. So where is the real journey, really speaking?
And you refer to Richard Ellman, who brought out the question of absurdity in life. But I don't see any absurdity here in this novel. I see references to all these things, but then they make us think, and think in a manner that, as if there's something meaningful in life. So even though he lives and he writes in the age of the absurd, he remains away from it, and he engages with things very seriously. I don't see any jokes here. I don't see any that kind of laughter or guffaw which is there in the absurd theatre at that time. What do you say?
So people have written about this novel also from the point of view of the kind of humor that he employs. But it's different. It's the kind of humor is not the kind of humor that one sees in a Waiting for Godot, and it also at times it's casual, but at times it's very, very dark also. So, I think this point about the absurd, in writing, I think is something that one really needs to interrogate, because we have to ask that the writing is not absurd. I think the writers who write in the 1950s, they come up with these new styles, new techniques. I mean, Sartre has already kind of, put forth his theory of existentialism and how existence precedes essence and so on. So, the absurd too, I think, is the individual's inability to relate anymore to the world that has become extremely inhuman. And especially, in the aftermath of the Second World War, this was very, very poignantly felt. So, how does the individual who feels totally, left out and desolate, isolated from the world in a sense, how does the individual deal with it? So, it becomes the writer's task to then ask these questions, and it is something to think about, that writers of the 50s particularly, whether in the novel form or in the genre of drama, felt that it was important to revisit and to in fact totally reject the old forms and come up with new forms. And somehow Molloy is a classic example of this. It's almost as if Beckett is asking the reader, which style do you like more? Which style fits the times? Is it Moran's style, or is it the style of supposedly Molloy?
Maybe he's mimicking, the act of the shopkeeper. He's showing them many things and say, you just pick up. There will be humor there, perhaps.
Yes.
And as you said, that he's experimenting with the technique, he's experimenting with language, he's also experimenting with the mental states of the characters. And I agree with you, and this is a new insight, that even though he's not exactly writing about the absurd, but he's taking the absurd very seriously.
Yes.
And he's in fact saying that when the world is lacking all the good things that people can swear by, that they can be inspired by, that itself is a critique, and that absurdity actually is the essence of life at that time. This is the jargon of existentialists, and it gels with that. And he's living in the heyday of existentialism at that time. Sartre is around, Camus is around,
Yes.
and he's interrogating with them from England, from Ireland, in their language, in his language.
Absolutely. In fact, if we just look at this one last quotation where he says, Moran says, "Does this mean I'm freer now than I was? I do not know. I shall learn." Then I went back to the house and wrote, "It is midnight. The rain is beating on the windows." It was not midnight. It was not raining. So this is a classic example again of negation that is brought out more through the objective stance. But I felt that the questions that, and I shared that with the viewers, the questions, about a set of 10-12 questions that come in the second part of the novel towards the end, I think they, in a sense, of course, carry the seed of his style of writing drama, but they also carry within them a culmination of the two styles, where he finally, I think what he's doing in part 1 and part 2 very differently, they kind of are finally put forth in the form of questions, and therein lies, I think, also the seed of this style of writing where he practices brevity in writing plays. So and the novel again ends on this, that it was raining and it was midnight, and yet it was not midnight and it was not raining.
In two sentences, what does the novel say?
The novel tries to evolve a new form of writing that is able to represent the contradictions of the times.
Well, friends, Dr. Payal Nagpal has interpreted the major novel of Beckett from the point of view of contemporaneity. And this is what the mood was in the 1950s, around the time that this person was writing, and that he was raising questions. He was not giving answers. In fact, when you think of the questions, then you get the answers yourself. They are inherent, they are inbuilt in the questions. But he doesn't separate the questions from answers, and he would say there are no answers. And that's what negation is for him. So negation actually for him is acceptance, as Dr. Payal Nagpal has very perceptively and very convincingly put forward. So thank you, Dr. Payal Nagpal and viewers. Thanks to you also. You heard all this, and mull over it, think about these questions, and these questions are actually the essence of the writing of the post-Second World War situation. Thanks.